Tom Hartmann is now officially Farron Cousins' #1 recommendation after his own show and presumably What You Can Do. I just assumed it didn't even need to be said in that segment. For a good reason. He tells you the historical context of what's going on. He tends to get right to the source of the problem. And he above all, has an understanding of who some of these devils are. Boy, this one is a doozy. And if you want to know a little bit about why the young cats who are following this these days don't like to identify as Democrat, well, maybe it's stuff like this. Because Elliot Abrams is a U.S. war criminal. And Joe Biden just nominated him for a rather insulting seat. Let's have a look.
This is amazing. Elliot Abrams. I remember Elliot Abrams. I was wide awake during the Reagan administration in the 1980s. I mean, I was basically wide awake, from like 1966 forward because of the Vietnam War, 67, let's say. Elliot Abrams was working for Ronald Reagan, and Reagan was taking the money illegally, by the way. Congress passed a law saying that the Reagan administration may not supply weapons or money to the Contras. Now, that was specifically in Nicaragua, but more broadly that we were not to be supporting right-wing guerrilla movements in South or Central America. And when Reagan was selling spare parts, military spare parts, to Iran illegally, he did this in gratitude for their holding the American hostages until the moment that he was sworn in on January 20th, 1981. As he put his hand on the Bible, they released the hostages. That was the Iran part of the Iran-Contra deal. So then for the next 6 years, he was selling weapons to the Ayatollah, Ronald Reagan, and his entire administration, until he finally got busted for it. And then he was taking the money from illegally selling those weapons and using it to buy weapons here in the United States and ship them down, or ship money in some cases, down to Central America, into Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and totally screwing up those countries. And there was this death squad in El Salvador that we trained at Fort Benning, that we trained at the School of the Americas. And in 1982, it was called the El Mozote Massacre. More than 800 civilians. This was in El Salvador. It was by the Atlacatl Battalion. Forgive me, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. These were these government soldiers who had been trained by us. And New York Times reporter Raymond Bonner wrote about seeing, quote, the charred skulls and bones of dozens of bodies buried under burned out roofs, beams, and shattered tiles. He listed 733 names, mostly women and children and old people, that were murdered by this death squad.
I'll spoil it. Elliot Abrams, because I don't think Hartmann even goes into the details of how bad Elliot Abrams as a human being is. Elliot Abrams admitted to micromanaging these death squads. It did that and other atrocities like it. We trained terrorists here. We sent them to a country to go terrorize, and they did under the command of Americans. We got to own that. We need to take responsibility for that. I mean, we just have the obligation, the moral obligation, and I'll tell you, the legal obligation. Even if the rest of the world doesn't have the firepower to enforce it, we have the obligation. It's one thing to pretend like it never happened. At least then we could be considered cowardly, but at least ashamed of ourselves. It's something else entirely to pretend like this person can still be treated like an upstanding member of society, because that says that we don't think we did anything wrong. Not that it never happened, but it says that we don't think that what we did then was wrong, and that's wrong. So not only do I think that this person's influence, rather, let me rephrase this. Not only do I think that it would be an insult to the survivors, if there are any from those massacres, to the entire country, as a matter of fact, that we effed up with our hubris and our greed. But also, this person, if you want to go purely heartless with it, this person has demonstrated that they don't have very good decision-making abilities. At a minimum, there's that. He's been nominated. He's not been confirmed. We're going to get there in a moment.
We later learned that it was 811. His reporting, Bonner's reporting on this in the New York Times, led Elliot Abrams and others in the Reagan administration to conduct a smear campaign against Bonner, the reporter, and the New York Times that was so successful that the New York Times pulled him off the South American beat, or the Central American beat. And this is what Bonner wrote in 2019, 4 years ago, in The Atlantic. He wrote, quote, "The Reagan administration, with Elliott Abrams as point man, routinely defended the Salvadoran government in the face of evidence that its regular army and allied right-wing death squads were operating with impunity, killing peasants, students, union leaders, and anyone considered anti-government or pro-guerrilla. Abrams went so far as to defend one of the death squad's most notorious leader, Roberto de Obasan, who was responsible for the murder of Archbishop Oscar Romero when he was saying Mass in March of 1980. I remember that. That was the assassination that touched off the Civil War in El Salvador. Well, that guy, Elliot Abrams, who was the apologist for the death squad and participated in helping fund them, or it appears he participated, is the guy that Mitch McConnell wants to be on a bipartisan commission. And President Biden has cycled the name through because Mitch McConnell put it up. It's wrong.
It is wrong, and I cut off Tom Hartmann at the end there because the last sentence he says is, write your senators. Tell them you refuse to have this man confirmed. He's a war criminal. He's an embarrassment. Elliot Abrams has no business in any sort of leadership in the United States. He has no business out here in a grocery store shopping next to decent folks. He belongs in prison. He has no business being a free man, bothering the rest of us, seeing him and knowing that there is injustice yet in the United States. But he certainly, at a minimum, has no business on any sort of commission. So, there's a link in the description. There's a basic overview of what to talk about. You click on the link, you can find your representative. Talk to your senators. It is senators that we need to speak to. Tell them you want them to vote against confirming Elliot Abrams for any commission. This man should be in prison and not in a leadership role in our government. It's that simple. Write an email or make a phone call, but tell your senator you won't have it. Time we learn.